Have you ever been left with a bad taste in your mouth? Ugh. As we continue in this series, Faith Hacks, 5 practices for real life, today we're going to look at how our lives can create that bad taste in others, and in ourselves, and in faith. I'm glad you're part of this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob. It's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. Let me take just a moment to remind you of the interactive teaching videos available for kids and families that are available on Facebook. A simple search when you're on Facebook for Cabin Kids will take you directly to that resource and our page. We've been thinking during these weeks, wouldn't it be great if we just kind of knew everything that we ever needed to know? I can only imagine how situations would be different if we only just kind of knew it all. But we don't. And sometimes even the stuff we know can be hard to put into practice, can't it? We kind of know things about our body and how we need to exercise and eat, but too often those things kind of fall to the side. Well, over these days we've been looking at God's toolbox, and as we look inside, we kind of get an idea of how He seeks to grow us. So we're going to continue to tackle that learning process that He takes us on as we discover what He's seeking to show us. So you may want to go back and over the course of the 5 weeks, look at the 5 different practices that are a part of Faith Hacks related to real life. Today we're going to look at the statement, in the life of faith, the way up is down. So let's jump in. So you know that moment when your food is in front of you and your expectations for how it's going to taste, and you take the first bite and your expectations are absolutely imploded. It was nothing like what you thought. It just kind of is awful. It's not subpar, it's not unimpressive, it's just bad, and you almost feel like you want to scrape the taste off of your tongue. Now, my wife is an absolutely fantastic cook. That's why this memory we were talking about recently is so unique and so out of the ordinary. When we were first married, just under a year, we were trying something creative with leftovers. And so in the kitchen, she was kind of adding a little of this and throwing a little of that into it and throw a little bit of this and etc. And so we sit down to eat and we both kind of take a first bite, and I don't say anything, and I could see by the look on her face that it wasn't really resting all that well. So I kind of took another bite and I was like, oh, I don't think that's very good. And she's like, yeah, I don't think that's good at all. I think we're going to have to eat out tonight. And I'm glad that she thought it was awful too. It was one of those things that was like, well, we tried that and failed, but you know what? We'll know better another time. Well, it would have been awkward if she would have loved it and I would have hated it. You know, I can remember that because it was so, like I said, out of the ordinary. It's so isolated. It's never happened since then. But we've all had those experiences where something left a bad taste in our mouth. It could have been food, or sometimes it's some other type of experience altogether that leaves that bad taste. As we get into the scripture today, that bad taste is a little bit like what James is talking about related to our life of faith. See, the people he was directly talking to and wrote to in the particular day, well, they were mixing a whole bunch of different things into their lives as they followed Jesus. A little sauce from their culture, a little seasoning of their personal agenda, a little blend of the life that they lived before they were following Jesus. And they all genuinely thought that they were doing great. So James is kind of stuck in that awkward moment we mentioned earlier, like, it's really not that great. James, like a bit of a taste tester here in chapter 4, says, the result of the way your life is tasting is really not good at all. And he has some strong things to say about how bad the taste is that's being left as a result of their faith. Let's look at James chapter 4, verses 1 through 17 and check out what we mean. What is causing quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from your evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You're jealous of what others have, so because you can't get it, you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet, you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again. If you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. Do you think that the scriptures have no meaning? They say that God is passionate, and the Spirit He has placed within us should be faithful to Him, and He gives grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God. God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow, we're going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We'll do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you're boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it's sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. Now, James' overall issue here is all the stuff that they've rolled into what it means for them to follow Jesus. This is the stuff that is making the taste of your life, he says to them, really gross, and we need to deal with it. It's like a whole exchange here, and we need to go in a completely different direction. A term that wasn't original with me, but probably could be used here, is that people were living like practical atheists, agreeing that God is critical to life, but operating on a daily basis like that does not matter at all. So they find themselves always hunting in their culture for the thing that will define what is their good life. Well, people were acting in their ways, as we read, to kind of lift themselves up and kind of create their own agendas. And this was creating a lot of conflict, a lot of problems. There were divisive groups with their own angles on the way things ought to go. And there was a very unappetizing taste of what Jesus really is. So it led them to looking like Jesus was following them instead of them following Jesus. And James expresses the way that that life is backwards and it's designed to be lived as a follower of Jesus, that in truth, the way up is down. Now, this was in total contrast to their culture, because what they would understand to be the way up and the way to continue to grow was through strength and through power. Power was the key, and absolute power was modeled by the Roman Caesars as well as many in local government. There were plots to obtain power or to take power over, with people who were Caesars in that era with names like Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius and Nero. And history has not been kind to their years in power and their activity while they were in authority. Systems of bribes of local officials, authorities looting local people by inflated taxes, confiscation of property to accommodate a person of power or preference, not to mention their system of public executions or abusive relationships and how in that era wives and children were treated as property. The sick and the weak are completely discarded. They're left to die on their own. Stories even abound of some of these individuals who were soaking some of their prisoners in flammable liquid as humans and then impaling them on a stake in the palace yard, burning a human for nightlight. We would consider this extreme abusive power. It was what they understood in their culture as just rule by brute force. It was normal for them. In their culture, for compassion to be expressed, it equaled weakness. So this narcissistic, pompous, selfish, egocentric people who arrived at the top came there through power moves, and that's just the way it worked. Now, some of us have had the privilege of traveling to places where people still live like this today. And we can see and have seen that it really creates significant chaos in the culture. But because of the impact of Jesus, we even culturally here in North America find this repulsive. Because Jesus comes along and he turns the whole thing upside down. He says the way up is not through power or struggle. The way up is through service and humility. The way up is down. So at the time James is writing this letter, in the neighborhood of 20 or 25 years after Jesus returned to heaven, people are still trying to figure out what it looks like in daily life to be able to walk the journey of reorganizing their life around what Jesus had taught. And James is really helping these followers of Jesus to wrestle with their daily actions so that what they say and what they do really do line up with life in the kingdom of God. But at this point, when he's addressing them, the seasoned taste of their life that was this blended mix was just not good. And James says, let's get rid of that. And let's look at life from the vantage point of God's priorities. Well, James says the things that you're striving for, control and power and influence, they're causing division. They're causing all kinds of fighting and relational messes. And he encourages them to go to the tough place to explore their priorities. Even in our culture, priorities can cause division for us. Even fighting or relational messes, chaos in our lives and beyond. So how would they or we even start to look at our priorities? The real ones, not just the ones that are the right answer. What are our priorities and we list them out, but what are the real priorities and how would we figure out what we really believe by the way that we act? I'd like to suggest to you that for us in North America, something that really does get down to our priorities is the way that we use money, use time, and expend our energy in life. Now these three really can be tools that direct and honor what God is doing, or they can be things that we exploit to achieve our own personal ends. So, if you are willing, let me encourage you to consider what it might mean to really drill down and discover what your true priorities are. What if you looked at your bank account for the last 20 to 30 days and saw where the bulk of your money is being spent? What if you looked at your calendar for the last week and saw where the largest portion of your time is being spent? What if you did an internet search that kind of looked at your list of searches for the last 48 hours and said, what is it that I've spent my time thinking about? Or maybe even in your casual time, if you wrote a list to say, what is it that I spend my time dreaming about when I'm all alone? Well, maybe you'd start to get a picture of the priorities as you look at where money and time and energy has been drifting. And so for those who are willing to take the next step, you might even ask, what does my life declare in those spaces where I say God matters? Does He really? Do I function with or without God? Do I function with Him just when I need Him, or do I function with Him daily? Or have we been swept up in saying things that are important, but then living like they're not? That's really the challenge that was happening for the people James was writing to. And these are common problems that they were facing and we often wrestle with too. Just as an example, we might say family is important to us. But what does that mean? Is it important that they do well in school? Is it important that we see them grow so that they have opportunities for career or for continued development and growth? Where would we put priority as it relates to their long-term faith development? When it comes to the money and time and energy we're willing to invest there, do we say that family is a priority and faith is a priority in our family? But when we look at our money and energy and time, it may not quite add up the same way. You see, the problem we all encounter is this long-term effect of a mix in our lives, naturally, of selfishness, and then we kind of find ourselves, because we're used to our own culture, pursuing that cultural success. And because that's what we're used to, we just kind of figure that's normal. But James warns us that this can lead to chaos in our lives and in the lives we impact. It can happen to us just like it did to the people James was writing to. And when it flavors our lives by blending all of these things together, well, maybe that's a moment where we need to be reminded to humble ourselves before God and to live a life where the way up is down. James is imploring them to examine their priorities, and we can too if we choose to. But he also looks at things and develops a conversation around practice. And he says to the first century audience, he says, you know what, you kind of have your own definition of what works for you in faith. It's as if they were cherry picking the things that they liked about following Jesus and then kind of ignoring the rest. A little bit like, I really don't need you over here, God. I think I've got this all figured out, but I need you over here. I want you to stay out of that because that's my territory. Reorganizing faith around what we like instead of around the whole of Jesus' teaching, boy, that can be challenging and easy to fall into because there are things that are a part of Jesus' teaching that are less than comfortable. Putting life with Jesus into practice is humbling. Choosing to allow God to describe what is right and wrong with us, and then allowing Him to work and change in our lives, things that sometimes we may think are fine, stuff we even like for that matter. But reorganizing our lives around His teaching instead of our preferences means allowing Him to shape us and humbling ourselves, allowing Him to be in charge of the whole process. An image that helps me kind of work with that as it relates to understanding this part of faith is to think of my life as a house. And inviting Jesus into the house, he starts to look around as a house guest, and maybe he's a little bit nosy, but you're kind of like, well, I have friends that are a little bit nosy too. But then he gets tinkering. And so he no longer starts to act like a house guest. He picks things up and you're kind of like, oh, wait, please don't touch that. Leave that alone. I really have that there for a purpose. He's no longer acting like a guest because then he offers to maybe clean something. And you're kind of like, well, that's fine. That's very courteous of you, but I don't want you to go in that room over there. Then he might try and repair something. But then he pushes it and he really gets on your nerves and he wants to renovate. And you're thinking, I invited you into this place and now you're acting like you're the owner. Like you just want to move around and do whatever happens. And I like that wall where it is. As a matter of fact, I never had any idea in my life that I would ever pull whatever is in that storage area out and clean it out. But then you realize, wait a minute. If I really look at life the way Jesus teaches, I'm the guest and he's the owner. And I need to develop an understanding of what it means to let him work on my house as he chooses. So James kind of pokes at the people in the first century who were reading this, and everyone who's read it since, at how they're following Jesus in everyday practice in allowing him to be the one who sets the agenda. It's pretty easy to slide into a life that blends culture, because not every culture is all bad and not every culture is all good. And it's our own preferences and sometimes the things that we like, we kind of know who we are and what we like and blend it in with a little bit of selfishness, and we end up with this life after a while that's centered on Jesus following us and not really on us following him. We end up seeing Jesus maybe more like a genie, right? Where we look to him to make our wishes come true. As a cosmic valet, you ask and he obliges, and we become the ones who are in control. We control the limits. We dictate what God can and cannot do, and what we believe about God becomes something that dictates who God can be and how he can continue to operate in our lives. James says, oftentimes that kind of life where we're trying to control it and we're trying to manipulate it, that's bad faith. And it leads to chaos and selfishness. And we know we don't want to create all of that around us, so we need to get down to the root of the problem. And we need to have a look at our priorities and our practice. And even where we find that we're in the lead instead of God, James says, that puts a bad taste of faith in people's mouths, and that's not good. It even puts a bad taste in God's mouth. So for us today, how do we put this into practice? How do we get started to think about having our lives actually be a great taste in God's mouth, in our mouth, and in the people around us as well? Well, what would an honest look at our priorities reveal about the flavoring of our lives? What have we blended in there as we really start to dive down and see what our true priorities are based on how we spend maybe our money and our time and our energy? Priorities that we say are important, but maybe they're missing in our actions. And in practice, who is really in charge of the decisions in our lives? Is God just a convenient resource, or is he growing more and more to be the center of the decision-making grid in our lives? Our answers to that on a growing basis is an indication as to whether or not, as James says, if our faith will leave a bad taste or not. So maybe, just maybe, in this Thanksgiving season, it could be time to take another look at how to live what Jesus teaches, the whole of what he teaches. And that is that the way up is down. As we get ready to pray today, let me just mention the podcast extras. There are some worship at home resources, as well as some conversational or even journaling questions that can be helpful there. Some links to other ministries in our church, as well as giving. And so let me encourage you to check that out. You'll find that in the description box of either YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching this video. That link will take you to our Kingston Standard Church website and help you to be able to go from there. Let me take a few minutes and let's pray together. Let's ask God as we come into this day what he would have us do with our priorities and practice as we consider what our lives are leaving as a taste in his mouth. God, We're so grateful for who you are today and the fact that ultimately you coach us and nudge us along this journey and help us as we learn what it means to follow you. And sometimes we need your forgiveness because we kind of get that backwards. We get it so that we think that you're following us and that you're at our disposal. But ultimately, we as your people are a resource for you. And you long to continue to shape us and mold us. You're the owner of our lives. And so as we think about what that means and the implications that are a part of that, sometimes it can be scary because we're comfortable with some of our normal or what we consider as our usual. And so God, today, as we consider our priorities and our practice, I pray that you would help us to continue to engage with you, to love you, to open ourselves to you, and have an honest conversation with ourselves and you as to what you're up to in our lives. We thank you and we praise you. In your name I pray. Amen. Thanks again for taking a few moments to be here with us today. And before you go, if you wouldn't mind taking just a moment to like, comment, or share this video, it's always an encouragement to us when you do. And if you haven't had an opportunity to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to like us or follow us on Facebook, then let me encourage you to take that action too as soon as this video is over. And as always, we're praying for you. We trust you're praying for us too, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.